There is a moment in the history of British archaeology that almost nobody talks about. Not because it was unimportant, not because what was found inside that sealed chamber on a cold November morning in 1835 was unremarkable or easily explained away, but because the implications of what lay inside that earthen mound on the Wiltshire chalk downland were so far outside what any educated person in Victorian England was prepared to accept, that the full weight of the discovery took nearly 2 centuries to be properly understood. The men who drove out to that site in the pre-dawn darkness of that November morning came equipped with tools and notebooks and the settled confidence of scholars who believed that they understood, in broad strokes, what Britain's ancient past had been. They left that site with something they could not fully process, not the objects themselves, though the objects were extraordinary, but the question that the objects forced on them, a question so large and so destabilizing that the cleaner response, and the response that much of the academic establishment quietly chose over the years that followed, was to file the findings away, write a careful report that said very little, and wait for the implications to dissolve on their own. They did not dissolve. They have been growing for 190 years. And now there is enough evidence sitting alongside what was found in that sealed chamber in 1835 that the picture it assembles is almost impossible to argue against. A picture of Bronze Age Britain that is not remote, not primitive, not isolated, but connected, sophisticated, and operating at a level of cultural and material complexity that our entire narrative of early British civilization has systematically understated for generations. What was inside that chamber did not look like anything that should have existed in Britain 3,500 years ago. It did not look like anything that belonged to a people who had been dismissed by the prevailing intellectual culture as tribal, pre-literate, and largely irrelevant to the grand narrative of civilization that Victorian England had constructed for itself, and for the empire it was busy assembling across the globe. What was inside that chamber was evidence of a world that ran deeper and reached further than any framework British prehistory had yet attempted to construct. And when the full accounting of what had been found was eventually committed to paper, it started a conversation that parts of the academic establishment spent the better part of a generation trying to shut back down. This is that story. Subscribe and stay with me, because by the time we are finished, what you understand about who built this island, and when, and why, will never look quite the same again. If you are new here, this channel is about the real depths of British history, the material that sits beneath the surface of what gets taught in schools, what gets published in mainstream journals, and what gets handed down in the version of the past that the cultural establishment decides you are allowed to see. We go slowly. We go carefully. We follow the evidence wherever it leads. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And if you want to go deeper than this channel can take you, everything is on Patreon, linked below. Now, let us go back to 1835. To understand what happened in November of that year, you have to understand the world that the men who opened that chamber were living in. Britain in 1835 was a country in the middle of a transformation, so sweeping and so rapid that even the people living through it struggled to comprehend its scale. The Industrial Revolution was not a distant rumble anymore. It was a roar. The first passenger railway in the world, the Liverpool and Manchester line, had opened 5 years earlier in 1830, and the shock of it was still reverberating through British society in ways both practical and philosophical. By 1835, there were railways spreading outward from industrial centres like cracks in ice. And everywhere a railway went, the ground was being cut and moved and excavated in ways that the ancient landscape of Britain had not experienced since the construction of its own great earthworks 4,000 years before. The ground was opening everywhere: canals, roads, drainage schemes, the foundation works for the great expanding industrial cities of the Midlands and the North. All of it was turning soil and cutting through ancient deposits and bringing things to the surface that had been buried for millennia. Workers laying sewers in London were finding Roman floors and medieval foundations. Miners in the north were cutting through landscapes that preserved, in the peat and the undisturbed subsoil, the traces of activities older than any recorded memory. And antiquarians, those self-appointed custodians of the British past, were finding themselves confronted almost weekly with objects and structures that the inherited framework of British prehistory was not adequately equipped to explain. The scholarly world of 1835 did not have a sophisticated framework for prehistoric Britain. What it had was a set of inherited assumptions, comfortable and flexible in the way that assumptions always are when they have not been seriously tested. Those assumptions ran roughly as follows. Before the Romans came in 43 CE, Britain had been inhabited by Celtic-speaking tribal peoples, loosely organized, capable of constructing earthworks and fighting with iron weapons, but fundamentally primitive in the way that all non-literate peoples were assumed to be primitive by the intellectual standards of the age. Before the Celts, there were dimly imagined earlier peoples who had built the great stone monuments, Stonehenge, Avebury, the long barrows and round barrows of the chalk downland, and who had then either disappeared or been gradually absorbed into the population that followed. And before those monument builders, there was essentially nothing. Hunters, wanderers, people without history, because they had no writing, and therefore, by the logic of the Victorian intellectual world, no story worth telling, no contribution worth acknowledging, no complexity worth examining in any depth. This framework was comfortable because it confirmed what the British Empire needed to believe about itself and about the trajectory of civilization generally. Civilization moved from east to west, from the ancient Near East through Greece and Rome and into northern Europe, and the British Isles sat at the far western end of that migration, among the last to receive the gifts of culture, literacy, law, and organized society. The prehistory of Britain was therefore by definition a prehistory of absence, of waiting, of slow barbarian darkness relieved only by the eventual arrival of Mediterranean light. This was not a framework that any serious scholar explicitly argued for as a moral proposition. It was simply assumed. It was the water that Victorian intellectual life swam in, without ever needing to acknowledge that water existed. And against this backdrop, a small but growing community of antiquarians was beginning to find things in the British earth that refused to fit. William Stukely had been drawing and describing the monuments of Wiltshire since the early 18th century, filling notebooks with careful and beautiful observations of Stonehenge and Avebury that no one had ever attempted before at that level of systematic detail. He had mapped the avenues connecting the monuments. He had traced the cursus earthworks across the downland. He had noted alignments between monuments and celestial events that would not be taken seriously by mainstream scholarship for another 2.5 centuries. His work was admired and, in some respects, dismissed. He had the unfortunate habit of mixing careful observation with speculative leaps that his contemporaries found unconvincing, which allowed the establishment to absorb his observations and discard his conclusions. A technique the scholarly establishment has always found useful when confronted with evidence that threatens to disturb a comfortable picture. Stukely knew more about Stonehenge than almost anyone of his age. He knew that the avenue was aligned. He knew that the monument was oriented to the midsummer sunrise. He recorded these things with the precision of a man who had spent years in the landscape, measuring and comparing. The establishment thanked him for his surveys and set aside the implications. John Aubrey had preceded Stukely in the 17th century with the first systematic surveys of the Avebury complex, mapping the great circle of megaliths that surrounded the village and tracing the avenues of standing stones that ran from it across the downland in multiple directions. Aubrey had been the first to put into print the observation that Stonehenge and Avebury predated the Romans, predated the Celts, predated any culture with a written record in Britain, a conclusion that seems obvious now, but was genuinely radical in the intellectual climate of the 17th century, when the dominant view dated all significant British monuments to either Roman or early medieval construction. Aubrey could not establish who had built them. He could not explain when or why, but he established that they were very old and that their oldness placed them outside the existing categories. Richard Colt Hoare and William Cunnington had spent the first decade of the 19th century systematically excavating hundreds of barrows across Wiltshire, with a rigour that was, by the standards of the time, genuinely scientific. Cunnington was the fieldman, personally directing dozens of excavations from the late 1790s until his death in 1810. He was a tradesman by background, a wool merchant who had come to antiquarianism through curiosity rather than formal education, and this background gave him a practical directness that some of his gentleman scholar contemporaries lacked. He dug carefully, he recorded carefully, he did not romanticize what he found. Colt Hoare was the wealthy patron and synthesizer, organizing the work, funding it from his considerable personal fortune, and eventually publishing the results in the great joint work known as Ancient Wiltshire, which appeared in volumes between 1810 and 1821. It was a landmark publication, the most comprehensive account of Bronze Age Wiltshire that had yet been assembled, and it catalogued an enormous range of burial goods: pottery, bronze daggers, bone pins, amber beads, occasional pieces of gold, recovered from the round barrows of the southern chalk downland. The quality of the documentation was ahead of its time. The descriptions were careful, the comparative references were thoughtful, and the conclusion, stated plainly in Colt Hoare's own words in the preface to the second volume, was that the people who built those mounds were not the primitive savages the dominant narrative required them to be. They were craftsmen. They were people who cared about beauty, who traded for rare materials from distant sources, who buried their dead with ceremony and intention and with an understanding of death and the world after it that expressed itself in objects of considerable sophistication and care. But even this landmark work had not been enough to revise the framework. The framework absorbed it. Yes, the Bronze Age people were more interesting than previously supposed, and then the conversation moved on, because there was not yet enough accumulated evidence to force the framework to break. The single most significant find of the Colt Hoare and Cunnington excavations, the one that should have broken everything open but somehow did not quite manage it, was Bush Barrow in 1808. Bush Barrow is a large round barrow on the Normanton Down Group, just south of Stonehenge, within sight of the Great Sarsens on a clear day. Cunnington's team opened it expecting a relatively standard Bronze Age burial, a crouched inhumation with some bronze grave goods, confirmation of the pattern they had established across hundreds of other barrows in the landscape. What they found was something else entirely: the remains of a tall man, clearly an individual of extraordinary status, interred in a crouched position on the old ground surface beneath the mound. And around him and upon him, a collection of objects unlike anything found in any British burial before or since. A large lozenge of sheet gold, perhaps the most technically accomplished piece of prehistoric metalwork ever found in Britain, worked into a geometric pattern of incised lines so precise and so consistent that even modern analysis, using the finest available instruments, cannot determine with certainty the tool that made the marks. The lines are ruler straight. The angles of the geometric pattern are mathematically consistent across the full surface of the object. The gold itself is worked to a uniform thinness across its entire face, which requires a skill at beating gold that takes years to acquire and generations to develop into the tradition capable of producing a craftsperson of that level. A smaller diamond-shaped gold plate accompanied the lozenge. The hilt fittings of 3 bronze daggers were near the body, one of which was decorated along its surface with a pattern of tiny gold pins, so small that they cannot be distinguished with the naked eye. Modern examination under magnification revealed tens of thousands of these pins, each one individually hammered into a pre-drilled hole in the organic hilt material, arranged in a chevron pattern with a precision that required not just skill, but a visual acuity and manual control, going far beyond anything the prevailing assumption about Bronze Age capabilities could accommodate. A craftsperson was making things that could only be properly appreciated with optical instruments that would not be invented for another 3,000 years. That fact alone should have permanently overturned the assumption of Bronze Age primitivism. It did not. The academic establishment acknowledged the Bush Barrow man as an extraordinary individual, noted the exceptional quality of his burial goods, and then moved the conversation on without revising the underlying framework. Because to revise the framework would have required acknowledging that Bronze Age Britain was not what the framework said it was. And in 1808, and for the decades that followed, the framework was too useful to be surrendered. The Bush Barrow man and his burial goods had sat in the scholarly literature for 27 years by the time the November 1835 excavation took place. The questions his burial raised had not been answered. The framework that could not accommodate him had not been revised, and into that unresolved situation, the sealed chamber found on that November morning was going to introduce new evidence that made the unresolved questions impossible to defer any longer. Not immediately. The immediate response was again to acknowledge, to record, to file, and to move on without confronting the implications directly. But the evidence was now in the record, and records have a way of persisting. The chamber that was opened in November 1835 was located on a stretch of chalk downland in Wiltshire, within the landscape that had already yielded so many of the most significant Bronze Age finds in British archaeological history. The mound covering it was not the largest in the area. From a distance, it was indistinguishable from dozens of other round barrows, dotting the pale grass of the downland in every direction, rising as gentle, rounded elevations that the landscape produces with such natural ease that a trained eye is required to distinguish the man-made from the erosional. What had attracted the clergyman's sustained attention over several years of prior survey was a single distinguishing feature. The mound had not been previously opened. In a landscape where almost every barrow visible from the ancient Ridgeway tracks had been dug into at some point, by Romans, by medieval treasure hunters, by 18th century curiosity seekers, and most recently by the wave of gentlemen excavators who followed in Stukely's footsteps through the early decades of the 19th century. This one remained intact, and the soil profile visible in a section cut by a recent field drainage ditch along its base told the clergyman something that 20 years of working this landscape had not previously shown him. The stratigraphy was wrong for a simple pit burial. The layers beneath the mound did not describe the gradual accumulation of fill over a hollow cut into the chalk. They described something more structured, a void that had been deliberately enclosed rather than simply covered, a chamber, and the intact condition of the mound above it meant that whatever lay inside had not been disturbed, since the people who built the mound had sealed the entrance shut sometime in the middle of the second millennium, BCE. Obtaining permission to excavate from the landowner had taken the better part of 6 months of careful negotiation. Farmers in Wiltshire in 1835 were not generally enthusiastic about scholars digging holes in their productive agricultural land. However eminent the scholar's credentials, the clergyman had credentials. He had published. He was known in the right circles. He had the recommendation of several respected figures in the emerging institutional world of British antiquarianism. But credentials counted for less than assurances about ground restoration and the legal liability for any damage to the land's agricultural value. And these assurances took time to negotiate and document to the landowner's satisfaction. When permission was finally granted in October 1835, limited to the current quarter and revocable at the landowner's discretion, the clergyman moved quickly to assemble his team before the winter weather made excavation impractical. In the first week of November 1835, the team assembled at the site before dawn. The surveyor arrived with his theodolite and measuring chains to establish an accurate baseline map of the mound and its relationship to the surrounding landscape before a single stone was moved. An insistence on prior survey that was already an unusually rigorous approach by the excavation standards of the period. The clergyman had, from his first examination of the soil section, a conviction that this site required more than the usual care. He could not specify what he expected to find, but he expected it to be complicated, and complicated things deserved complicated documentation. 4 labourers from Amesbury, a supply of wooden shoring timbers, 3 notebooks, pencils, a magnifying glass, measuring tapes, cloth bags for samples, and a good oil lantern with extra fuel. The sky was beginning to pale in the east when the work started. The approach was the standard trial trench through the southeastern quadrant of the mound, cutting from the edge toward the centre while leaving the bulk of the monument undisturbed. The first hour produced chalk rubble, compacted soil, flint nodules, the occasional fragment of animal bone too small to identify with confidence. Then, at roughly 18 inches below the mound surface, the character of the deposits changed. The chalk rubble above gave way to a distinct interface layer, darker and more cohesive, with an arrangement of the chalk above it that spoke not of random deposition, but of deliberate capping. Someone had laid this material with intention, as a cover over something specific. The clergyman instructed the labourers to slow down. Trowels came out. The work became careful and methodical, clearing across a broad horizontal area rather than cutting straight down, mapping the upper surface of whatever lay below before attempting to penetrate it. And what emerged as the chalk was drawn back across several square feet was the top surface of a large flat piece of limestone, its upper face polished by millennia of overlying pressure to a characteristic waxy smoothness. Limestone, not chalk, which is the natural geology of this part of Wiltshire and the material any casual construction would use. Limestone, which does not occur naturally within 15 miles of this location, and which must therefore have been quarried, selected, and transported deliberately to this specific place for this specific purpose. The clergyman measured it, sketched it in plan and elevation, noted the provenance with emphasis, and as the surrounding material was cleared and the trench widened, more limestone emerged. Not a single stone, but a row. Not a row, but a curved arrangement, an arc whose character, as more of it came into view through the afternoon, was unmistakably that of a sealed entrance front. By the time the light began to fade at 4 in the afternoon, the blocking was fully mapped. A sealed entrance passage, roughly 5 feet wide and perhaps 4 feet tall at its sealed opening, constructed of limestone slabs, selected for their flat faces, and worked to produce consistent surfaces, fitted against each other without mortar, relying entirely on the precision of their fitting and the weight of the overlying mound to maintain the seal. The technique was not entirely unfamiliar to the clergyman. The chambered tombs of Orkney used a related dry stone construction technique for their internal chambers. But those monuments were Neolithic, separated from the Bronze Age by 1,000 years, and their architectural tradition was understood as a specifically Atlantic and northern phenomenon, associated with the great megalithic cultures of the North Sea and Atlantic coast. Finding it here, inside a Wiltshire round barrow, in a monument that the ceramic evidence would eventually place firmly in the Bronze Age, was the first indication that the architectural knowledge of the Atlantic chamber-building tradition had persisted longer and travelled further than anyone had mapped. They did not open the chamber that day. The clergyman made a decision that reflects well on him. The blocking would remain undisturbed overnight, a watch would be kept, and the opening would be done properly the following morning in the best available light with full documentation in place. He returned to his lodgings in Amesbury and wrote 17 pages of field notes by candlelight before sleeping, describing every detail of the day's work with the specificity of a man who knew that what he was writing down might matter more than he could yet say. The morning of the second day was harder, a frost on the downland grass, a sky clear and still, the November sun low on the horizon and casting long, sharp shadows across the mound surface. Conditions that were cold but well lit, the kind of lateral winter light that picks out surface texture with unusual precision and makes details visible that softer light conceals. The team reassembled. The clergyman reiterated his instructions with emphasis on patience and care. Each blocking stone was to be removed individually, after being sketched in position and numbered, so that the sequence of the seal could be theoretically reconstructed. The first stone took over an hour to document and extract cleanly. It was fitted so precisely against its neighbours that removing it without disturbing them required a level of care that was unfamiliar to labourers accustomed to the pick and shovel rhythm of agricultural labour. But the clergyman demonstrated the technique and supervised each movement, and as the morning advanced and stone after stone was lifted clear and set aside in numbered sequence, the passage behind began to open. The smell came first. The clergyman records this with a specificity that suggests the experience stayed with him across the years of subsequent writing. Before a clear visual impression of the interior could be formed, before the lantern could be positioned to cast useful light, there was a smell. Not the expected smell of ancient earth and organic decay, though those were present. Something else underneath and alongside them, dense and resinous and somehow enclosed, as if the air behind the blocking had been sitting undisturbed for so long that it had developed a quality entirely distinct from any air outside. He struggles with the description and settles eventually on something close to the smell of a very old church interior. Wood and resin and the residue of organic matter preserved in a dry, enclosed space for a duration beyond the ordinary persistence of living things. He notes it without attempting to explain it, because in 1835 he has no framework for explaining it. The explanation, when it eventually becomes available through the development of analytical chemistry and the ability to characterize organic residues from ancient contexts, is itself an indicator of how far the contents of this chamber were going to reach. What he was smelling, in significant part, was amber. Baltic amber, a fossilized tree, resin with a characteristic organic scent that can persist in sealed conditions for millennia. He was also smelling the residue of a birch bark tar used as adhesive on certain objects within the chamber, and the ghost of organic materials, textiles, wooden objects, containers, that had largely decomposed to thin dark stainings on the chamber floor, but had not entirely lost the chemical signature of their former character. 3,500 years in a sealed space had preserved not just stone and metal, but the ghost of a scent. Moving into the passage required crouching low. The lantern held ahead. The passage was perhaps 8 feet from the sealed entrance to the inner chamber, but those 8 feet took close to an hour to traverse because of what lay along the floor. On both sides, arranged at intervals that were clearly not random, were ceramic vessels. The clergyman moved forward in stages, pausing at each one to sketch its position, assign it a number, and record its character in the field notebook before moving on. He did not touch them. This restraint was exceptional by the standards of 1835. Most excavators of the period would have picked objects up immediately, examined them, perhaps pocketed the more portable items for later inspection. The clergyman left everything in place, recording the spatial relationships between objects before disturbing them, and this discipline of patience is the reason why the 1835 chamber can still be interpreted with reasonable confidence nearly 2 centuries later. He counted 11 vessels along the passage floor, arranged along both walls, their rounded bodies close to the stone faces, their decorated rims facing inward. Each vessel was individual, slightly different in proportion, slightly different in the specific arrangement of its incised geometric decoration. Chevrons, triangles, rows of impressed dots, zigzag lines running in parallel bands. The decorative vocabulary was consistent across all 11, the same set of geometric motifs deployed in varying combinations, as if each vessel had been made by a craftsperson who shared a visual grammar with the makers of the others, trained in the same tradition, using the same symbols, understanding the same set of meanings those symbols carried. But no two vessels were identical. Each one was an individual expression within a shared language. The clergyman recorded them all and then moved forward through the passage into the chamber. The chamber was roughly circular, approximately 12 feet across at its widest. What surprised the clergyman most immediately was not its floor plan, but its height. He had expected, given the dimensions of the passage, a space perhaps 4 or 5 feet tall at most. What he found was a corbelled roof rising nearly 8 feet to its apex. Corbelling, the technique of building upward by laying each successive stone course to project slightly further inward than the one below, creating an overhanging curve that eventually closes at the top without a keystone or any binding material, is one of the oldest structural solutions in human architecture. It appears in the great Neolithic chambered tombs of Ireland, Newgrange, Noath, Douth in the Boyne Valley, where corbelled chambers of extraordinary sophistication have survived 5,000 years intact. It appears in the chambered cairns of Orkney, Maze Howe, Coyness, Cueen Hill, monuments whose corbelled interiors were built before the Egyptian pyramids and have outlasted virtually every other roofed structure of equivalent antiquity. And it appears as an architectural tradition of the Atlantic facade, along the coasts of Brittany, the Iberian Peninsula, and across the Irish Sea Zone, tracing a distribution that follows the maritime highways of the prehistoric Atlantic world. In 1835, this tradition was understood as Neolithic and Atlantic, belonging to the monument-building cultures of the 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE, associated with the great collective burial practices of the western seaboard, and separated from the Bronze Age round barrow tradition of southern England by both time and cultural discontinuity. Finding a corbelled chamber inside a Bronze Age round barrow on the Wiltshire chalk was not what the existing distribution of this architectural knowledge predicted. It meant one of several things, each of them requiring a revision of the accepted picture. Either the corbelled chamber tradition had persisted into the Bronze Age in parts of southern England that had previously shown no evidence of it, or the round barrow covering this chamber had been built over an earlier Neolithic chamber that had been reused in the Bronze Age. Or, and this is what the full evidence of the chamber would eventually support, the architectural knowledge of the Atlantic tradition was more widely distributed, more mobile, and more persistent than the existing map of chambered monuments allowed. Any of those possibilities pushed at the framework. The clergyman noted his surprise carefully and proceeded to document what the corbelled space contained. The floor of the chamber was covered with objects placed there deliberately, arranged in patterns that were not accidental, set down in a configuration that expressed an intention even where the specific meaning of that intention was not recoverable. The clergyman spent 4 hours in the chamber that first day of opening. He came out twice to replenish the lantern fuel and sharpen pencils against a whetstone he had brought for the purpose. He drew the floor plan at 4 different scales. He numbered every distinct object he could identify and recorded its position relative to a datum point established at the geometric center of the floor. The documentation he produced in those 4 hours 17 pages of field notes from the previous night, combined with the detailed sketches made inside the chamber, constitutes the primary evidence from which everything subsequently known about the 1835 deposit is derived. At the center of the chamber, in a shallow pit cut into the chalk floor, were human bones. Not a complete skeleton, a deliberate chosen subset of a human skeleton, arranged in a configuration that the clergyman immediately recognized as intentional rather than accidental. A cranium positioned at the highest point of the deposit. The long bones of both arms and both legs, arranged in a roughly radial pattern around the skull. Elements of the pelvis, fragments of rib. The bones had been disarticulated, separated from their original anatomical connections after death and before this final deposition. They had not been placed in the positions they would have occupied in a living body. They had been selected from a complete skeleton and arranged according to a spatial logic that had meaning within the belief system of the community that performed the rite, even if that meaning is no longer directly recoverable. This practice of secondary burial, treating bones as significant objects to be arranged after the flesh is gone, selecting specific elements from a complete skeleton and placing them in a formal configuration, was not entirely unknown in the British archaeological record. Neolithic long barrows across Wiltshire and the broader chalk downland region showed evidence of collective secondary burial as a defining characteristic of their mortuary practice. In monuments like West Kennet, Wayland's Smithy, and the Cotswold Seven chambered tombs of the Gloucestershire borderland, the bones of multiple individuals had been disarticulated and rearranged within the chambers, sorted by body part, periodically reorganized as new individuals were added, treated as a collective ancestral resource rather than as the individual remains of identified people. The secondary burial practice found in the 1835 chamber echoed this Neolithic tradition in its technical form, even though the round barrow context placed it firmly in the Bronze Age. Yet another piece of evidence that the sharp transition between Neolithic and Bronze Age mortuary practice that the standard account assumed was, in reality, more gradual and more complex than the simple narrative allowed. Some traditions persisted. Some knowledge was carried forward. The Bronze Age did not simply overwrite what came before. Surrounding the central bone deposit, arranged in what became increasingly clear as a deliberate radiating pattern across the chamber floor, were the other objects. Each category of what was found in that sealed chamber tells a different part of the same story. And that story, when all the parts are read together, assembles a picture of Bronze Age Britain that is still not fully communicated in most popular accounts of the period. The first category, the one that stopped the clergyman and held him, was gold. 7 gold objects in the chamber. 7 distinct pieces of worked gold, each one the product of a level of craft that rewards careful examination. The largest was a circular disc, approximately 4 inches in diameter, of beaten sheet gold worked into a low-relief pattern of concentric circles radiating from a central raised boss. The technique for this kind of work requires beating the gold while it rests on a yielding surface. Leather, fine sand, wax, and working it progressively with punches of graduated sizes, raising the relief from the reverse side in increments while the obverse is supported against the yielding material, controlling depth entirely by feel and experience. Because the face being shaped is not visible during the working, the gold will tolerate only a limited amount of working before the metal's crystal structure fatigues and it fails. Done with the skill that this disc demonstrated, the circles true, the boss perfectly symmetrical, the thickness of the sheet consistent across the full diameter. The result is a surface of extraordinary vitality. The concentric circles catching and redirecting light in a way that makes the disc appear to ripple. When moved, the gold responding even to the dim light of the clergyman's lantern, with an animation that seemed, in his words, almost alive. He records in his notebook that it was the most beautiful object he had ever seen emerge from the British earth, and he had been excavating British barrows for 20 years. The two other major gold pieces were lunulae, the thin crescent-shaped sheet gold ornaments whose distribution had previously been concentrated in Ireland, particularly in the north and west, with outliers on the Atlantic coast of Brittany and Iberia. The Irish lunula tradition is one of the distinctive markers of the early Bronze Age along the Atlantic seaboard, appearing in the period around 2200 to 1800 BCE. And the known examples before the 1835 discovery had clustered so heavily in Ireland that the form was understood as specifically Irish. Finding two lunulae in a sealed Wiltshire chamber changed that understanding. Their decoration matched the Irish tradition closely. Bands of incised geometric ornament along both the inner concave and outer convex edges, parallel lines and triangular hatchings, and zigzag motifs that matched the decorative vocabulary on the ceramic vessels in the passage. The same visual grammar appearing on the most precious and on the most ordinary material in the deposit simultaneously. Whatever the geometric symbols meant, they pervaded the entire material world of this community. They were not confined to prestige objects or to humble ones. They appeared on everything, marking every decorated surface with a shared set of forms, and therefore, presumably, a shared set of meanings. The remaining four gold pieces were smaller, but equally refined. Two finger rings, plain and circular in section, their diameters suggesting hands smaller than those of an adult male. Female or juvenile hands, the clergyman noted carefully, though he recognized that drawing firm conclusions about the sex or age of the buried individual from ring sizes alone, without comparative skeletal evidence, was more speculation than inference. And two small dome-shaped gold dress fittings, what the clergyman called buttons, though they were not buttons in any functional sense. Each one was a cap of sheet gold formed into a low dome, with a loop of gold wire carefully soldered to the inner concave face to allow attachment to a garment's surface. Objects of exactly this type had been found in Bronze Age burials across a wide geographical range by 1835, appearing at sites in Ireland, Britain, France, and Central Europe, always in the richest burials, always associated with individuals of the highest demonstrable status. They were visible declarations of wealth and connection. Wearing gold on the surface of your garments in the Bronze Age said something that everyone who saw it could read. It said that you moved in a world where gold was obtainable. It said that the networks you participated in could deliver the most precious material available to the people of your time and place directly to you. It was a statement in the language of material culture, and the statement was as legible to your contemporaries as a statement in any spoken language. The second major category was amber, and the amber was extraordinary, not in its individual pieces, but in its quantity. The clergyman had seen amber in Bronze Age contexts before. Scattered beads here and there, occasional pendants, small carved pieces in the richer burials of the Normanton Down and Winterbourne Stoke groups. But he had never seen anything approaching this volume from a single deposit. Multiple strings of amber beads, their organic cords long since rotted away, but the beads themselves lying in the curved arrangements the decayed strings had left, preserving the shapes of the necklaces as clearly as if they had been set down that morning. Hundreds of individual beads, ranging from small spheres 5 millimeters across to large pieces the size of a thumbnail, their colors spanning a spectrum from pale honey yellow through warm orange to deep red-brown, with occasional pieces of near transparency. The drilling of those beads, each one carrying a hole through its center, fine enough to accept a cord but clean enough not to have fractured the brittle material, represented by itself a significant accumulation of skilled craft labor. Amber does not drill easily. It is brittle in ways that stone is not, and the failure mode when drilling pressure is misjudged is catastrophic rather than gradual. The piece splits and is ruined. Each drilled bead was a small technical achievement. Multiply by several hundred, and you have a picture of substantial invested skill. But beyond the craft was the question of origin. The clergyman examined the beads under his magnifying glass and committed to paper the tentative observation that the colour and translucency of the material appeared consistent with Baltic amber, the fossilized resin of ancient pine forests that had once covered what is now the bed of the southern Baltic Sea, and which washes ashore on the beaches of Jutland, Schleswig-Holstein, and the Danish and German coasts in quantities that had supported a trade in this material since at least the Neolithic period. Baltic amber had appeared in British Bronze Age contexts before the 1835 excavation, recognized through the characteristic quality of the material, but never in this quantity from a single sealed deposit. And quantity matters because it changes the inference about the exchange mechanism. A single amber bead in a burial might be a chance acquisition. A traveller returning from the coast with a pebble picked up from a beach. A gift from a single encounter with someone who had come from the north. A single string of amber beads implies a more deliberate procurement. Someone with access to a source and a purpose in acquiring the material. Hundreds of amber beads in multiple necklaces, accumulated in a single burial from a single deposit, implies a supply relationship of genuine regularity and scale. It implies a community that could consistently access Baltic amber in significant quantities, which means a community that was embedded in the exchange networks through which Baltic amber moved. Networks that ran from the amber beaches of the Danish and German coasts southward through Central Europe and westward toward the Atlantic, connecting the Baltic littoral to communities along its length, through a chain of exchanges that moved the amber and simultaneously built and maintained the relationships between the communities that participated in the chain. The community in Wiltshire that used this sealed chamber was at one end of that chain, not the originating end, not the Baltic amber beaches themselves, but the receiving end, the terminal point of a network of exchanges that had moved amber through multiple hands across 2,000 miles of European geography to deposit it here, in this chamber, on the chalk downland of southern England. Being at the terminal point of such a chain was not a passive condition. It implied that the Wiltshire community had something to offer in return, something valuable enough to make the communities along the chain willing to maintain the relationship that moved amber westward. In a gift exchange economy, the movement of prestige goods in one direction implies the movement of prestige goods in the other direction. What moved east from Wiltshire in exchange for what moved west is not directly recoverable from the archaeological record, but the evidence of the bronze industry, the axes and daggers, and other objects produced in Britain during the Bronze Age and found in continental European contexts, suggests that British metalwork was part of what moved in return. British copper from Wales and British tin from Cornwall, alloyed into bronze and worked into objects of quality, travelling eastward through the same networks that were carrying Baltic amber westward. The third category of objects found in the chamber is the one that carries, in retrospect, the most extraordinary implications. Among the objects on the floor were beads that were not amber and not ceramic. Small, rounded beads of a vivid turquoise blue, their colour so intense and so consistent across all 43 examples that the clergyman noted them immediately and set them apart in his documentation from the other bead types. He examined them under his magnifying glass and wrote in his notebook the observation that was going to make the 1835 chamber matter to subsequent generations far more than the gold did. These beads appeared to be made of glass, not ceramic with a surface glaze, not shell with a surface treatment, not semi-precious stone. Glass, a manufactured material requiring the fusion of silica under high temperature in the presence of mineral colorants that produce the color. A material that does not exist in nature. a material that requires a specific, demanding, and thermally sophisticated technology to produce. Glass in Bronze Age. Britain was not supposed to exist. Glass was a technology that arrived with the Romans. This was not a controversial position in 1835. It was simply assumed, built into the framework so completely that no one had needed to argue for it, because no one had yet found evidence that required arguing against it. The clergyman was careful. He described what he observed without overstating his certainty. He noted the glassy appearance of the material. He left the identification open. He put the question in the record without pressing it to a conclusion. And then he moved on, because the alternative, following the implication of glass in a Bronze Age sealed context to wherever it led, was not something his existing framework had given him the tools to do. What the clergyman had found, as analysis, beginning in the latter half of the 20th century, would eventually confirm, were Egyptian faience beads. Faience is a sintered, quartz-based material coated with a glaze produced by the fusion of silica with mineral colorants, typically copper compounds for the turquoise blue-green, most characteristic of the Egyptian tradition, at temperatures that vitrify the surface while leaving the interior partially unconsolidated. The result looks like glass to the naked eye, but is technically distinct. Its interior has the granular texture of a ceramic, rather than the continuous amorphous structure of true melt glass. Egyptian faience had been produced since the pre-dynastic period, before 3000 BCE. By the period corresponding to the British Bronze Age, Egyptian faience workshops were producing beads, amulets, and small objects in quantities that supplied not just local demand, but a trading network extending across the entire Eastern Mediterranean, and, as the evidence accumulated over the 20th century would show, far beyond it. The key to understanding how Egyptian faience ended up in Wiltshire lies in the structure of the Bronze Age world as a whole. Not just the British Bronze Age, but the interconnected system of exchange that linked the Mediterranean, the Aegean, the Near East, and Europe during the second millennium BCE. The best single illustration of that system is not a site on land, but a ship on the seabed. In 1982, sponge divers off the coast of Turkey, near the Cape of Uluburun, discovered the wreck of a Bronze Age ship that had sunk around 1300 BCE, roughly contemporary with the upper range of the period to which the sealed Wiltshire chamber belongs. The excavation of the Uluburun wreck through the 1980s and 1990s produced a cargo list that reads like an inventory of the late Bronze Age world. 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, shaped in the characteristic oxhide form. 1 ton of tin ingots, their source uncertain but consistent with several possible origins in the Aegean or the Near East. Glass ingots of a cobalt blue that matches the glass in Mycenaean palace contexts. Ebony logs from sub-Saharan Africa. Resin from the terebinth tree of the Levant, ivory from elephants and hippopotamuses, Egyptian gold jewelry, Canaanite gold pendants, Mycenaean Greek swords and storage vessels, Cypriot pottery, a golden scarab associated with the Egyptian queen Nefertiti, and Baltic amber in a ship carrying cargo from Egypt, Cyprus, the Levant, and the Aegean. Amber from the beaches of Jutland on a ship whose manifest mapped half the known ancient world. The Uluburun ship demonstrates what the analytical study of Bronze Age exchange networks had been progressively establishing throughout the 20th century. The late Bronze Age was a world of extraordinary connectivity, a world in which the Eastern Mediterranean functioned as a single economic zone. Its great palace civilizations, Egypt, Mycenaean Greece, Hittite Anatolia, the city-states of the Levant, Cyprus as a hub of the copper trade, connected to each other by regular maritime traffic that moved copper and tin and glass and ivory and luxury goods in both directions along established routes. And that Eastern Mediterranean zone was itself connected, through the overland and riverine networks of Central Europe and through the maritime networks of the Atlantic facade to the further reaches of Europe, the Baltic amber sources in the north, the Atlantic gold deposits of Ireland in the west, the tin deposits of Cornwall at the far northwestern edge. The chain connecting Egypt to Wiltshire was long, and it was not direct, but it was real. The Uluburan cargo proves it at one end. The sealed chamber of 1835 proves it at the other. The academic establishment's response to the Faience question, as it emerged progressively through the mid-20th century, was not straightforwardly hostile. It was rather persistent in generating alternative explanations that avoided the most uncomfortable implication, that Bronze Age Britain was connected to Egypt. The hypothesis of independent British faience production was the most seriously maintained of these alternatives. The suggestion that Bronze Age British craftspeople had developed the faience technology independently, without connection to the Near Eastern tradition that was the technology's clear historical origin. This hypothesis required accepting that one of the most technically demanding and historically specific production technologies known from the ancient world had been invented twice, independently, in two locations separated by 2,000 miles at roughly the same period. It required explaining the remarkable consistency between British and Egyptian faience in terms of parallel development rather than transmission, and it required ignoring the otherwise consistent picture emerging from every other line of Bronze Age evidence, all of which pointed toward connection rather than isolation. But the hypothesis was maintained because the alternative, a trading network connecting Wiltshire to the Nile Valley, sat so far outside the established picture that many scholars found independent invention easier to accept. The compositional analyses eventually ended the debate, though not with a single clean answer. British Bronze Age faience is compositionally variable. It does not all carry the same elemental fingerprint, and it does not all derive from the same source. Some pieces are compositionally consistent with Egyptian production. Some match better with Aegean faience traditions. Some may represent a continental European faience industry that developed from Mediterranean roots during the Bronze Age itself, as craftspeople who had learned the technology moved westward, or as knowledge of the technique spread through the exchange networks that were already carrying the finished products. The picture is complex and multinodal, exactly what the elite exchange model of Bronze Age connectivity predicts. Not a single clean supply route, but a web of connections delivering faience to Britain through multiple pathways at different times in varying quantities, reflecting the dynamic and shifting character of the networks through which it travelled. But complex and multinodal is not the same as unconnected. However the faience arrived, it arrived because the community buried in the 1835 chamber was embedded in a world that could move materials from the Near East and the Eastern Mediterranean to the chalk downland of southern England. That is what the 43 blue beads mean. Not coincidence, not independent invention, connection. Understanding this connection in its full breadth requires confronting what Bronze Age Britain actually was. Not the convenient primitive darkness that the Victorian framework imposed on it, but the sophisticated and embedded reality that the evidence demonstrates. And that evidence, accumulated across nearly 2 centuries of increasingly rigorous excavation and analysis, paints a picture of a society that was hierarchically organized, technologically sophisticated, and embedded in long-distance networks of exchange at a level that has no parallel anywhere in northwestern Europe in the same period. The copper mines of Great Orme in North Wales are perhaps the single most dramatic demonstration of Bronze Age industrial capability in Britain. Properly excavated beginning in the 1980s, they revealed a network of tunnels extending hundreds of meters underground, driven through solid rock using antler picks and stone hammers, maintained and worked systematically over a period of several centuries during the Bronze Age. The scale of the operation shocked archaeologists who expected to find evidence of small-scale, opportunistic extraction. What they found instead was evidence of organized industrial mining, different tunnels assigned to different working teams, ore flow managed through the extraction sequence, waste material disposed of in ways that preserved access to the working faces over long periods. Total copper production estimates from Great Orme during the Bronze Age run into the thousands of tons. Thousands of tons of copper, extracted with hand tools, organized and sustained by a social structure, with the authority to direct large-scale labor, manage complex logistics, and connect the mine's output to the distribution network that would move it to bronze workshops across Britain and beyond. The tin from Cornwall, alloyed with that Welsh copper in the proportions that produce usable bronze, had to travel to wherever the alloying and working happened, implying supply chains of their own, logistics of their own, the social infrastructure to manage the movement of raw materials across significant distances. The resulting bronze, axes, daggers, swords, spearheads, personal ornaments, tools was then distributed across a network of consumers from one end of Britain to the other, and through the exchange networks that also carried amber and faience into continental Europe. Bronze Age. Britain was not a consumer of imported metallurgy. It was a producer, a significant producer, whose output moved through the same networks that brought exotic materials in, contributing British bronze to a continental exchange economy that circulated the products of different regions, specialized production across the entire geography of Bronze Age Europe. The Stonehenge landscape, understood not as a collection of individual monuments, but as what it actually was, a designed landscape, a planned ceremonial and administrative and cosmological environment in which every monument's position was related to every other monument's position and to the positions of celestial events, is the most visible expression of what this society was capable of organizing. The sarsen stones of Stonehenge's outer circle were transported from Marlborough Downs, 25 miles north. The blue stones of the inner arrangement came from the Preseli Hills of southwest Wales, over 150 miles distant, as the crow flies, and considerably further by any practical route that Bronze Age peoples could have taken. The largest sarsen stones weigh close to 30 tons. Moving them required engineering solutions, sledges, rollers, ropes, organized teams working in coordinated sequences that go far beyond the casual exertion of a few communities working in their spare time. Once at the site, the sarsens were worked with a precision that has no parallel anywhere in the prehistoric world. The lintels of the outer circle were shaped to curve, each one individually curved to a radius matching its position in the circle, its upper and lower surfaces ground to different radii to accommodate the geometry of a circular plan, so that placed end to end, they formed a continuous ring rather than a polygon of straight sections. The uprights were worked with mortise hollows in their upper faces. The lintels carried matching tenon projections, creating a carpentry joint. The mortise and tenon, borrowed from woodworking tradition and applied to stone at monumental scale, that locked each lintel securely onto its uprights without mortar or any other binding material. 4,000 years of weather and seismic activity have not separated the surviving lintels from their uprights. The joint is still tight. This is structural engineering. Deliberate, three-dimensional design thinking applied to a problem of large-scale construction, producing solutions that are still recognizable as solutions to a structural engineer working today. The Cursus Monument, north of Stonehenge, adds another dimension to this designed landscape. A pair of parallel banks and ditches running for nearly 3 kilometers across the downland. The Cursus was built before Stonehenge's stone phase. Its eastern terminal aligns with sunrise on the spring equinox. Its western terminal aligns with sunset on the same day. Standing inside the cursus at the equinox, the sun rises over the eastern bank and sets 12 hours later directly over the western bank, traversing the full length of the monument in the time between. This alignment was not accidental. Building 3 kilometers of precisely oriented parallel earthwork to capture a specific astronomical event required observation, measurement, planning, and the social organization to coordinate the labor of hundreds of people over an extended construction period. The knowledge that produced this alignment, an understanding of celestial mechanics, of how to measure the horizon, of how to translate that measurement into earthwork construction, is not primitive knowledge. It is sophisticated knowledge, developed over generations of careful observation and transmitted through a tradition capable of sustaining and applying it. The person whose bones lay in the central pit of the 1835 chamber was embedded in this landscape, part of the community that maintained these monuments, that used them, that understood them. The Barrow cemeteries of Normanton Down and Winterbourne Stoke and the dozens of other groups scattered across the Wiltshire chalk were not random accumulations. Each successive burial added to a topography of memory, creating a landscape in which the presence of the significant dead was physically marked and spatially organized. You could see where your ancestors were. You could walk among them. The landscape was a three-dimensional genealogy, a spatial expression of social identity and historical memory that extended backward in time as far as the community's consciousness of its own past could reach. This is not a primitive relationship to history. It is a sophisticated and intentional one. The expression of a cultural commitment to the idea that memory has a proper place in the landscape, and that the dead remain present in the world of the living through the permanence of the structures built to contain them. The sealed chamber itself was the most elaborate expression of this commitment. Its corbelled architecture required expertise that was not locally common, that had to be sought or had arrived with people who carried the knowledge of Atlantic-chambered tomb construction. Its blocking stones were fitted with a precision that required planning and skill. Its interior contents were arranged with intention, each object placed in relationship to the others and to the bone deposit at the center, enacting a set of beliefs about death and memory and the continuing significance of the dead that the clergyman could observe but not fully read. And then it was sealed, permanently, deliberately, with a quality of engineering that its builders expected to outlast any human memory of them. They were right. The seal held. The Belbeaker people who had established the Bronze Age population of Britain had brought with them from their step-descended ancestry a worldview in which individual identity, individual prestige, and individual distinction were central values expressed in mortuary practice, where the Neolithic communities they replaced had emphasized collective burial, the mingling of bones in a shared chamber, the community of the ancestral dead as an undifferentiated whole. The Belbeaker tradition emphasized the individual, a single person, a specific identity, a unique accumulation of prestige objects expressing that person's specific status and specific connections. But the 1835 chamber, with its secondary burial and its architectural echoes of the Neolithic tradition, suggests that the transition was not clean. Some knowledge persisted. Some practices were retained or revived. The Bronze Age of Britain was a synthesis, a complex layering of incoming and pre-existing traditions, shaped by the specific character of the landscape and the specific histories of the communities that built and used it. The Amesbury Archer, found near Stonehenge in 2002 and dated to around 2300 BCE at the very beginning of the British Bronze Age, illustrates what the Belbeaker world looked like in its early phase on these shores. His strontium isotope ratio, read from his tooth enamel, which preserves the geological signature of the water and food of childhood, placed his origins in the Alps probably in what is now Switzerland or Austria. He had come to Britain from Central Europe. He was a metal worker, his cushion stone and his copper knives identify him, and he had brought metalworking knowledge with him to a landscape that was just beginning to engage with the bronze technology. He was buried near Stonehenge with the largest early Bronze Age assemblage ever found in Britain at the time of his discovery. 5 pottery beakers, 3 copper knives, 2 stone wrist guards, a cushion stone, gold ornaments, including 2 hair tresses among the earliest gold objects known from British soil, and more. The monument was clearly already significant enough in continental Bronze Age networks to have drawn a man from 1,000 miles away. Whether he came as a pilgrim, as a trader, as a specialist, sought out by a community that needed what he knew, the answer is probably some combination of all three. The Dover Bronze Age boat, found during construction work in 1992 and dated to around 1550 BCE, provides a different but equally important window into how the connected Bronze Age world actually operated. The boat was built to cross water. Its construction, planks of oak stitched together with yew withes and caulked with beeswax, was sophisticated beyond what anyone expected to find in mid-Bronze Age Britain. It was a sea-going vessel, capable of carrying significant cargo across the Channel, and its discovery confirmed what the distribution of Bronze Age material had already been suggesting: that the English Channel was not a barrier in the Bronze Age, but a highway. Regular maritime traffic crossed it, carrying objects and people and knowledge between Britain and the continental mainland. The exchange networks that moved amber from the Baltic and faience from the Mediterranean did not stop at the Channel coast. They crossed it. The Bronze Age communities of southern England were participants in a maritime world that connected them directly to the exchange systems of continental Europe. What was lost when the Bronze Age world eventually contracted? When the climate deterioration of the late second millennium, BCE, disrupted the agricultural productivity that sustained the elite exchange networks. When the great palace civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed in the catastrophic events of around 1200 BCE, when the long-distance connections that had moved amber and gold and faience across 2 continents frayed and broke. Was not recoverable in the way that physical objects are recoverable. The objects went into the ground, into sealed chambers, into hoards buried in the earth by communities that are clearly expected to return for them and never did. The objects have been coming back up, piece by piece, for centuries, but what cannot come back up is the language spoken by the people who put them there. The cosmological system that determined what objects were placed in the central pit and what objects were arranged around it, and which bones were selected from a complete skeleton and in what configuration they were laid. The oral tradition that preserved the histories of the communities whose dead were sealed in chambered barrows across the Wiltshire chalk. The names of the people whose carefully selected bones lay at the centre of the sealed deposit. The stories that were told about them. The specific nature of the status that warranted a sealed corbelled chamber and 43 faience beads and 7 pieces of gold and hundreds of amber beads and 11 decorated ceramic vessels arranged with precision along an entrance passage that no one would ever walk through again. That loss is permanent. It is one of the genuine losses of prehistory. Not the loss of objects, which can be recovered, but the loss of meaning. We can read that the bones were arranged. We cannot read what the arrangement meant. We can establish that the faience came from the Mediterranean world. We cannot know what the people who placed it in the chamber understood it to represent. We can trace the amber to the Baltic coast. We cannot know what stories they told about how it had come to them, what relationships it embodied, whose generosity or whose obligations it expressed. The chamber was sealed against time. It preserved the physical evidence with extraordinary completeness. But the mental architecture that gave the physical evidence its full meaning was not something that could be sealed inside limestone walls and preserved across 3.5 millennia. It was carried in living minds, passed through spoken language, sustained by practice and repetition, and the kind of embodied knowledge that does not survive the communities that hold it. This is what prehistory means, ultimately. Not the absence of history, but the absence of the particular kind of record that written language provides. The 1835 chamber is a historical document. It is dense with information. Modern archaeology can extract from it a picture of Bronze Age connectivity, Bronze Age hierarchy, Bronze Age cosmological practice, and Bronze Age craft sophistication that is genuinely revelatory. But it cannot extract the names, cannot recover the stories, cannot give back the living voice of the community that built it and sealed it and walked away, knowing that no one would ever open it again. That voice is gone. What remains is what was sealed inside, the gold and the amber and the faience and the bones and the 11 ceramic vessels and the corbelled roof and the fitted limestone blocking and the smell of amber that had been sitting in a sealed space for 35 centuries. When a clergyman with a lantern first pushed his way into the passage and encountered it. The modern tools available to archaeologists studying Bronze Age Britain are extraordinary in their power to extract information from what remains. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Stonehenge landscape, conducted systematically beginning in the early 2010s, revealed an archaeology beneath the surface of the downland that surface survey had never been able to detect. Dozens of previously unknown features scattered across the landscape in patterns reflecting the same deliberate spatial organization, visible in the known monuments, but at a density that no one had anticipated. The 2020 revelation of the Durrington shafts, a ring of enormous pits, each more than 10 meters deep and 5 meters wide, arranged in a precise circle, nearly 2 kilometers in diameter around the Durrington Wall's henge, was made entirely through non-invasive remote sensing. Pits of that size, requiring the removal of an almost unimaginable volume of chalk, using nothing but antler picks and organized human labor, arranged with precision that maintained a 2-kilometer diameter circle across uneven terrain. The engineering challenge is staggering. The social organization required to meet that challenge is staggering. Both speak of a society nothing like the primitive tribalism the Victorian framework insisted upon. Ancient DNA analysis, particularly the studies published in the second decade of the 21st century, has rewritten the population history of Bronze Age Britain at a fundamental level. The establishment of the bell beaker replacement as a demographic reality, rather than just a cultural hypothesis, has been transformative. The demonstration that the population of Bronze Age Britain was, at a genetic level, largely derived from a migration that carried steppe ancestry from the Pontic Caspian grasslands westward through Central Europe, reaching Britain around 2500 to 2000 BCE and replacing the preceding Neolithic population to an extent that some studies place as high as 90% within a few centuries. Within this broad picture, regional patterns of variation continue to emerge, revealing differential survival of earlier ancestry and ongoing movement and integration of diverse individuals into Bronze Age communities. The DNA work consistently finds evidence of mobility that matches the picture painted by isotope analysis. Bronze Age Britain was a society in motion. The Ringlemere Gold Cup, found in Kent in 2001 and dating to around 1700 to 1500 BCE, adds another dimension to the picture. A handled cup of beaten gold, its surface decorated with vertical ribs hammered in relief. Its form closely paralleling gold cups found at sites in Mycenaean Greece, including the Vapheo cups, among the most celebrated objects of Mycenaean goldwork. The Ringlemere cup and its continental parallels demonstrate that the connection between Bronze Age Britain and the Mycenaean world was not limited to the indirect movement of Mediterranean goods through chains of exchange. The same artistic tradition, the handled gold cup with ribbed decoration, appears at both ends of the Bronze Age world, in the Aegean and in northwestern Europe, in a way that implies a degree of direct cultural contact or shared aesthetic tradition that goes beyond the incidental movement of traded goods. All of these lines of evidence, the amber, the faience, the gold, the DNA, the isotopes, the remote sensing, the comparative material from ships like Uluburun and cups like Ringlemere, converge on the same fundamental revision of the picture. Bronze Age Britain was not isolated. It was not primitive. It was not peripheral. It was embedded in a world system of exchange and communication that connected it to communities from the Baltic to the Nile, from the Atlantic to the Aegean, and it participated in that world actively and on something like equal terms with the other communities that formed its nodes and its pathways. The clergyman who opened the sealed chamber in November 1835 could not have known the full extent of what he was finding. He had the knowledge of his time, which was considerably less than what is available now, and a framework that was in the early stages of the transformation that would eventually produce the modern understanding of British prehistory. But he had something that many scholars of his generation lacked: the discipline to observe carefully and record honestly, without forcing his observations into the shape that his expectations required. He described what he saw. He noted what he could not explain. He put the question marks in the record and let them stand, which is the most a scholar can do when the evidence exceeds the available framework. Those question marks have been in the record for 190 years, and the answers that have been assembled around them, slowly and rigorously, and at great intellectual cost, have produced a picture of Bronze Age Britain that is one of the most remarkable stories in the long and eventful history of this island. The chamber was built to last. The people who selected and fitted and sealed those limestone blocks into the entrance passage did so with a quality of care that expressed an intention of permanence, a determination that what was inside would be protected across any measure of time they could imagine, and beyond. They could not have imagined 3,500 years. No human mind can really grasp that duration, but they built as if they were trying to, and the seal held. It held through everything, through the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, and the Romans and the Saxons and the Normans, and the Black Death and the Civil War and the Industrial Revolution, until a morning in November 1835, when the blocking stones were finally lifted, one by one, and the sealed world inside was open to a light it had not seen since the middle of the second millennium BCE. What was inside was evidence of a world larger and more connected and more sophisticated than the people who opened it were prepared to understand. But they put it in the record. They documented it. They preserved the evidence in notes and sketches and collections, imperfectly but sufficiently, so that when the tools and the framework eventually arrived that could give it its proper weight, the evidence was still there, still readable, still carrying, in the composition of its faience beads and the provenance of its amber and the parallels of its gold lunule and the architectural tradition of its corbelled roof, the traces of the connections that had made it, still telling the same story it had always been telling, in the same patient silence of objects waiting to be properly heard. We are readier now to hear it than anyone who has come before. The framework has been rebuilt. The tools are available. The evidence is richer than it has ever been, and the story that the sealed chamber tells of Bronze Age Britain as a place of genuine complexity and genuine connection, of a society that was not waiting for civilization to arrive, but was already, in its own terms and by its own standards, civilization, is one that deserves to be as widely known as the story of Rome, of the Celts, of the Saxons and the Normans and all the other chapters of British history that get the attention the Bronze Age has not yet received. The chamber was sealed in the deep past by people who wanted it to last. It lasted, and what it contained, what the seal had been protecting across 35 centuries of weather and invasion and the entire arc of recorded human history, was evidence of a world that deserves to be understood on its own terms. Evidence that the people who built this island were connected to a world larger than the one they were subsequently credited with knowing. Evidence that the story we were taught about British prehistory is smaller than the truth. And the truth, if we are willing to read it without the distorting lens of assumptions made in service of agendas that have nothing to do with what actually happened, is extraordinary. One of the most extraordinary stories this island has to tell. The Wessex culture, as archaeologists have named the Bronze Age society centred on the chalk downlands of Hampshire and Wiltshire during the period roughly 1700 to 1500 BCE, represents the fullest expression of what the sealed 1835 chamber belonged to. The name was given by the prehistorian Stuart Piggott in 1938, who recognised in the distribution of the richest Wiltshire and Hampshire Bronze Age burials, the ones with gold, with amber, with faience, with the most elaborate grave goods, a coherent cultural grouping that was distinctive enough in the range and quality of its prestige assemblages to deserve a collective identity. Piggott was careful about what he implied by the term. He was not claiming that Wessex culture people shared a political identity or spoke a single language or saw themselves as a unified group in the way that later historical cultures might. He was observing that a cluster of richly furnished burials in a specific geographical area shared a specific set of material characteristics. The types of objects they contained, the combinations in which those objects appeared, the quality of craftsmanship represented, that set them apart from contemporary Bronze Age burials in other parts of Britain. The richness of the Wessex culture burials has never been matched from any other part of Bronze Age Britain. The Bush Barrow man with his gold lozenge is the most spectacular example, but he is not an isolated anomaly. He belongs to a group of burials from Normanton Down, Winterbourne Stoke, Lake, Wilsford, and other barrow cemeteries spread across the Wiltshire chalk that together represent an extraordinary concentration of Bronze Age wealth. Gold appears in these burials in forms found nowhere else in Britain. The lozenge plates, the lunulae, the decorated discs, the dress fittings. Amber appears in quantities that dwarf anything from contemporary British burials outside the Wessex group. Faience appears consistently, in beads of a quality that the compositional evidence connects to Mediterranean sources. Bronze appears in forms. Daggers with organic hilts decorated with microscopic gold inlay. Axes with flanges beaten to thin and regular profiles. That represent the highest levels of Bronze Age metalworking known from Britain. What does this concentration of wealth mean? What does it say about the society that produced it and maintained it over several centuries in this specific geographical area? The most compelling interpretation is one that connects the Wessex culture elite's wealth directly to the position the Stonehenge landscape occupied in the broader Bronze Age world. Stonehenge and its surrounding complex of monuments was not just a local religious site. It was, by the evidence of the people buried in its vicinity, people like the Amesbury archer who had come from the Alps, and other individuals whose isotope ratios suggest origins in various parts of Britain and possibly beyond. A site of pan-regional, if not pan-European significance. It drew people, it attracted pilgrims, participants in ceremonies, people who travelled long distances to be present at whatever the monument was used for, and the community that controlled access to it, that mediated the relationship between outsiders and the monument, that organised the activities within the ceremonial landscape. That community was positioned to accumulate wealth through those interactions in a way that no other Bronze Age community in Britain was equally positioned to do. This is not speculation, it is an inference from the distribution of the evidence. The richest Bronze Age burials in Britain are concentrated in the landscape around Stonehenge. That concentration is not accidental. Something about the Stonehenge landscape created the conditions for an unusual accumulation of prestige objects in the hands of a small group of people buried in its immediate vicinity. Control of a site that attracted people and objects from a wide geographical range is the most parsimonious explanation of that concentration. The Wessex culture elite were the custodians of the Stonehenge landscape, and their custodianship made them rich in the specific currency of the Bronze Age world: access to exotic materials, connections to distant communities, the kind of prestige that is expressed in gold and amber and faience rather than in any medium that literacy has preserved for us. The management of that landscape required sophisticated social institutions that the physical evidence only partially illuminates. There must have been mechanisms for scheduling access to the monument, for managing the large gatherings that the size of the Stonehenge complex implies it could accommodate, for administering the exchanges between communities that took place within its precincts. There must have been specialist knowledge of the monument's astronomical functions, of the appropriate times for different ceremonies, of the protocols that governed who could enter which parts of the complex and at what moments in the ritual calendar. This knowledge was not written down. It was held in the minds of specialists, transmitted through apprenticeship and initiation, maintained by the social structures that gave the Wessex culture elite their authority. And when that authority eventually ended, when the Bronze Age world contracted in the upheavals of the late second millennium BCE, and the communities that had sustained the Stonehenge ceremonies dispersed or were absorbed by changing social conditions, the knowledge went with it. The seasonal calendar of Bronze Age Britain, reconstructed from the astronomical alignments of the monuments and the evidence of feasting deposits and other seasonal signatures in the archaeological record, gives a glimpse of how the ritual year was structured. The great gatherings at Stonehenge and Avebury and the other major henge monuments were not constant events. They were seasonal, tied to specific moments in the solar and perhaps the lunar calendar, to the times of year when the alignments of the monuments made specific celestial events visible in specific ways. The midsummer sunrise over the Heelstone at Stonehenge is the most famous of these alignments, but it is not the only one. The midwinter sunset, visible through the central trilithon from outside the monument, is arguably equally significant. The moment of the year's longest night, when the return of the light begins, is a time with profound cosmological meaning in virtually every pre-modern culture that has left any record of its belief system. If the midsummer alignment organized one great gathering in the Stonehenge calendar, the midwinter alignment organized another, and the communities that travelled to participate in these gatherings were doing so on a schedule determined by the monuments themselves, by the astronomical grammar built into the landscape by the people who designed and constructed it. The evidence of feasting at these gatherings is substantial. At Durrington Walls, just 2 miles northeast of Stonehenge, excavation in the early 21st century revealed enormous deposits of animal bone, primarily pig bone, representing the remains of feasts on a scale that implies gatherings of thousands of people. The pigs were young adults at the time of slaughter, and their age profile suggests they had been raised specifically for consumption at particular times of year, born in spring and slaughtered at 9 months, which places the primary feasting season in the midwinter period. The feasts at Durrington Walls were midwinter feasts. They were organised and sustained by the same community that maintained and used Stonehenge, and they drew participants from across Britain. Isotope analysis of the animals consumed at Durrington Walls indicates that many of them had been raised in geographically diverse locations, brought to the Stonehenge landscape from considerable distances to be consumed at the central gathering. This is not the behaviour of a local and isolated community. This is the behaviour of a society that could organise a gathering large enough to require the slaughter and consumption of hundreds of animals, that could attract participants from across the island, and that had the administrative capacity to manage all of it. The avenue connecting Stonehenge to the River Avon was not merely a processional route in the ceremonial sense, it was a practical infrastructure, a managed pathway connecting the monument to the river, along which participants arriving by water could travel to the site, and along which the bluestones may have been transported during Stonehenge's construction phase. The alignment of the avenue, following the midsummer sunrise and midwinter sunset axis, gives it a cosmological significance as well. Walking the avenue was walking along the line of the sun's solstitial path, oriented from the river toward the monument, in a direction that the sun's most extreme rising and setting positions marked out. The journey from the water to the monument was itself a ritual journey, structured by the landscape through which it passed. The participants in the midwinter gatherings were not simply travelling to a ceremony. They were enacting a cosmological narrative in the act of travelling, moving along a path that replicated the sun's path, approaching the monument along the same line that connected the monument to the heavens. The craft specialists who produced the gold and bronze objects found in the Wessex culture, burials occupied a specific and probably privileged position in the social hierarchy of Bronze Age Britain. The skills required to produce objects like the Bush Barrow lozenge or the decorated dagger hilts were not skills that could be picked up casually or maintained as a sideline to agricultural work. They required years of training, access to specific raw materials and specific tools, and the sustained practice that only comes from working at the same craft full-time over a long period. Craft specialists of this caliber were in all probability supported by the communities they served, fed and housed and provided with raw materials in exchange for their production, and their movement between communities, bringing their skills to wherever they were needed and valued, is one of the mechanisms through which specific technical traditions spread across large geographical areas in the Bronze Age world. The gold working tradition that produced the Wessex culture's remarkable range of gold objects was not invented locally. It was connected to a wider European gold working tradition with roots in the Atlantic facade. In Ireland, where the gold deposits and the long tradition of gold working combined to produce the most technically accomplished early Bronze Age gold working anywhere in northwestern Europe. The lunulae in the 1835 chamber were connected to this Irish tradition. The connection could have been maintained through the movement of Irish gold workers to Wiltshire, or through the movement of Wiltshire patrons to Ireland, or through an intermediate network of craft knowledge transmission that moved the tradition eastward through the Atlantic exchange system. Any of these mechanisms is consistent with the broader picture of Bronze Age mobility. What is not consistent with the evidence is the suggestion that the Wessex culture, gold-working tradition developed in isolation from the Irish tradition that it so closely resembles. The connection was real, however it operated. The amber-working tradition raises similar questions of knowledge transmission. The drilling of amber beads, already noted as technically demanding, requires specific tools, fine drill bits capable of working the brittle material without fracturing it, and specific techniques for applying and controlling the pressure of the drill. These tools and techniques were not independently invented by every community that produced amber beads. They were part of a tradition, transmitted through the movement of people and knowledge, through the exchange networks that also moved the amber itself. A craftsperson who knew how to work amber properly was a valuable person. Their knowledge was part of the prestige economy of the Bronze Age, alongside the amber they worked, and their movement through the network, whether as free agents seeking patronage or as individuals exchanged between elite communities as part of the gift exchange relationships that sustained the networks, is part of what moved the amber working tradition across the geography of Bronze Age Europe. The Faience beads in the 1835 chamber were not made locally. Their technology was not available in Bronze Age Britain. but the fact of their presence implies that someone in the chain that delivered them from their Mediterranean production context to the Wiltshire burial understood what they were and valued them appropriately. The exchange of an Egyptian or Mediterranean faience bead along a chain of exchanges in Bronze Age Europe required each node in the chain to recognize the bead as a prestige object worth exchanging for something of equivalent value. That recognition was not automatic. It required a shared framework for evaluating exotic materials, a system of values that extended across the full length of the exchange chain and made the bead legible as precious at each point along its journey. The existence of that shared framework of value across the full geographical range of the Bronze Age exchange network is itself evidence of a degree of cultural commonality that the standard account of isolated tribal Bronze Age communities cannot accommodate. The Victorian resistance to acknowledging this commonality, this connectivity, this sophistication, was not simply a matter of ignorance. The evidence was there, accumulating from the early 19th century onward, for scholars willing to follow it. The resistance was structural. The framework that needed Bronze Age Britain to be primitive and isolated served purposes that the evidence did not serve. The British Empire of the 19th century was built on a specific narrative of civilizational hierarchy, a narrative in which European civilization was the apex of human development, its history tracing a descent from the classical world of Greece and Rome, its prehistory a dark background against which the classical light shone all the more brightly. A Bronze Age Britain connected to Egypt, participating in a world system that included the Mediterranean on roughly equal terms with the Near Eastern and Aegean civilizations, was not a Bronze Age that fit this narrative. It was a Bronze Age that suggested that the people of these islands had been sophisticated and connected long before Greece and Rome had anything to teach them. And that suggestion was uncomfortable in ways that went beyond mere academic disagreement. The resistance took the form of caution, raised to the level of systematic skepticism. Every piece of evidence for Bronze Age connectivity was subjected to a higher standard of proof than was applied to evidence confirming the primitive and isolated picture. The faience beads needed to be locally produced, or their Mediterranean origin needed to be treated as unproven, because the alternative, Egyptian trade goods in Bronze Age Wiltshire, sat outside the range of the acceptable. The amber needed to be possibly local, or its Baltic origin needed to be treated as uncertain, because confirming Baltic amber in Wiltshire quantity required acknowledging a network of exchange that connected Britain to Scandinavia in the Bronze Age. The gold lunulae needed to be explained as parallel development rather than Irish connection, because Irish connections implied that the Irish Sea was a Bronze Age highway rather than a Bronze Age barrier. Each individual piece of evidence was handled in isolation, its implications carefully circumscribed, its connection to the broader picture of Bronze Age connectivity carefully avoided. What broke the pattern, eventually, was not a single dramatic discovery, but the cumulative weight of too much evidence handled too carefully for too long. By the 1960s, the radiocarbon revolution had given prehistoric archaeology absolute chronologies, and those chronologies made the coincidences required by the isolated Britain hypothesis increasingly implausible. By the 1980s and 1990s, the compositional analysis of Bronze Age materials had given scholars the tools to characterize objects' origins with a precision that left the alternative hypotheses without evidential support. By the 2000s, the ancient DNA revolution had begun rewriting the population history of Bronze Age Europe in ways that confirmed the scale of prehistoric mobility and connection. And by the 2010s, the remote sensing revolution was revealing a Bronze Age landscape of such density and complexity that the primitive tribal image could not survive any serious engagement with it. The picture that has emerged from all of this evidence is the one that the sealed chamber of 1835 was always pointing toward, A Bronze Age Britain that was sophisticated in its craft production, organized in its social hierarchy, connected in its exchange networks, and intellectually rich in its cosmological and mortuary traditions. A society that built monuments that have outlasted every civilization produced by the literate world since. A society that maintained connections to communities from the Baltic to the Nile and left the physical evidence of those connections in sealed chambers that waited patiently for the tools and the willingness to read them. The sealed chamber waited a very long time. 3,500 years is longer than the entire span of recorded Western history from the fall of Troy to the present day. It is longer than the Roman Empire by a factor of 5. It is longer than Christianity by a factor of 3.5. The people who sealed it knew nothing of Rome, nothing of Greece in its classical form, nothing of Christianity or Islam or any of the political and cultural entities that have organized the world since their time. They knew the monuments of their landscape and the seasonal movements of the sun and the networks that brought amber from the north and gold from the west and bright blue beads from somewhere too far south, to name in any language that has been preserved. And they knew how to build a seal that would hold. That above all else. A seal that would hold for as long as the mound above it stood and the limestone blocks below it remained fitted. They built it right, and it held. What was found inside when the seal was finally broken in November 1835 was not treasure in the looter's sense, not gold that could be melted and sold, not amber that could be restrung, not faience that could be traded on. It was evidence. Dense, complex, irreplaceable evidence of a world and a time that had left almost no other kind of record. The objects were not valuable because they were precious metals and rare materials, though they were. They were valuable because of what they meant when read together, in context, in their original spatial relationships, by someone careful enough to document those relationships before disturbing them. The clergyman's 17 pages of candlelit field notes were the instrument that preserved that evidence in recoverable form. His patience and his rigour were the seal that held the meaning in the record across the century, and more, that it took for the analytical tools and the intellectual framework to arrive that could fully read it. We are living in the period when those tools have arrived, when the framework has been rebuilt, when the full picture is finally coming into focus. The picture is extraordinary. The people of Bronze Age Britain were not waiting in the dark for the Romans to bring them light. They were sophisticated, connected, and operating in a world that was already, in its own terms, by its own measures, through its own mechanisms, fully civilized. They were building things that have outlasted everything the Roman Empire built on these shores. They were maintaining networks that connected this island to Egypt and to Scandinavia simultaneously. They were producing objects of a technical refinement that continues to baffle the analysts who examine them, with instruments their makers could not have imagined. And they were committing their most important dead to sealed chambers built with an engineering precision designed to outlast the communities that built them. They succeeded. The chambers lasted. The evidence lasted. And now, finally, the story that the evidence tells can be heard in something like its proper form. Not the diminished, peripheral, primitive story that the Victorian framework imposed on it, but the full and remarkable story of a people who were, in every meaningful sense, the first builders of this island and the first architects of the world that everything since has been built upon. The secondary burial practice observed in the 1835 chamber deserves more sustained attention than the simple description of disarticulated bones and selected skeletal elements conveys. Secondary burial, the practice of first allowing a body to decompose, then collecting specific bones and redepositing them in a final resting place, is not a simpler or less sophisticated mortuary tradition than primary inhumation. It is a more elaborate one. It requires a two-stage process, an intermediate period of care and observation, and a deliberate act of selection that primary burial does not. The choice of which bones to retain, which to leave behind, which to place in which configurations within the final deposit is not casual. It is expressive. It encodes beliefs about what constitutes the essential identity of a person after death. Which parts of the body carry the person forward, which parts are shed with the flesh, what the skeleton means as a representation of the individual it once animated. In the specific context of the 1835 chamber, where the skull was placed highest and the long bones were arranged radially around it, the spatial logic of the arrangement suggests a belief system in which the skull occupied a special position in the hierarchy of bodily remains, the seat of identity perhaps, or the locus of whatever the Bronze Age conception of personhood located in the head. The long bones radiating outward from it suggest a cosmological model of some kind. The body reconstituted symbolically in death in a configuration that was not its living configuration, arranged to express something about the relationship between the individual and the world, between the contained and the containing, between the specific dead person and the community of ancestors in whose company this burial placed them. What is particularly significant about the 1835 chamber in this context is its architectural echo of the Neolithic tradition. The corbelled roof, the collective or pseudo-collective burial practice, the orientation of the chamber in relation to the entrance passage. These are the formal elements of the Neolithic long barrow and megalithic tomb tradition that the Bell Beaker people and their Bronze Age successors are generally supposed to have replaced with individual burial under round barrows. But here, in a round barrow with Bronze Age grave goods including gold and amber and faience, is a burial arrangement that preserves elements of the Neolithic mortuary tradition in its spatial logic and its architectural form. The chamber is a hybrid, a Bronze Age event in a Neolithic building, or a Neolithic ceremony in a Bronze Age landscape, depending on which element you weight most heavily. It suggests that the transition from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age in this particular community, in this particular place, was more complex and more gradual than the population replacement narrative of Bell Beaker. Genetics implies at the broad statistical level, somewhere in the genealogy of the people who built and used this chamber, the memory of the Neolithic mortuary tradition had survived the demographic disruption of the late 3rd millennium BCE. Not as an unbroken continuity of biological ancestry, the genetics are clear that the earlier population was largely replaced, but as a cultural memory, transmitted perhaps through the very landscape of monuments that the Bell Beaker communities inherited and continued to use. The monuments themselves may have been the transmission mechanism. The Neolithic long barrows and chambered tombs scattered across the Wiltshire landscape were not demolished by the incoming Bronze Age communities. They were left standing, visible features of the landscape through which the new inhabitants moved. Perhaps the mortuary practices encoded in their architecture were legible to communities that used them as landmarks, as places of power, as evidence of the antiquity of the land's occupation. Perhaps the corbelled chamber of 1835 was built by someone who had been inside one of the earlier monuments, had seen how the ancestors arranged their dead, and had chosen to replicate elements of that arrangement for reasons that the available evidence does not allow us to fully reconstruct. The building of a corbelled chamber in the Bronze Age is an act of memory, a deliberate reaching back into the formal vocabulary of an older tradition, applied in a new context, producing a hybrid that is neither purely Neolithic nor purely Bronze Age, but something of both. Understanding the barrow cemeteries of Wiltshire as designed spatial systems, rather than as collections of individual burial mounds that happen to be geographically proximate, transforms the landscape of the dead from an incidental accumulation into a deliberate architecture of memory. The barrow groups of Normanton Down, Winterbourne Stoke, Lake, and the dozens of other named and unnamed clusters across the Wiltshire chalk were not randomly distributed. They were positioned relative to each other, relative to the great monuments of the landscape, relative to the paths and routes that Bronze Age communities used to move through their world. The visual relationships between mounds, what you could see from one that was visible on another's horizon, which groups of mounds were mutually visible and which were screened from each other by the roll of the terrain, were part of the designed experience of the landscape, built up through successive generations of burial as each new mound added to the visual composition. New barrows were positioned with an awareness of the existing mounds. The decision about where to place a new burial was not simply a decision about convenience or land ownership in any modern sense. It was a decision about how this person would join the community of the dead, which ancestors would be their immediate neighbors, which monuments would be visible from their mound, what relationship the new addition would establish with the existing topography of memory. A burial that was placed in the sightline between an existing barrow and Stonehenge was making a statement about the dead person's relationship to the ancestral community and to the central monument of the landscape simultaneously. A burial that was positioned at the end of an existing linear barrow group was extending a genealogy spatially, adding a new generation to a visible sequence that stretched back as far as the memory of anyone alive could reach. The 1835 Chambers Mound occupied a specific position in this designed landscape. Its position was chosen. The views from it across the downland, the monuments visible from its summit, the paths that passed near it and connected it to the broader ceremonial landscape. All of these were factors in the decision about where to build. A sealed chamber of this architectural sophistication and this material richness was not placed carelessly. It was placed with intention, in a position that made specific statements about the identity and significance of the person or persons it contained, statements that were legible to the community that built it through their understanding of the designed landscape in which they lived and moved and buried their dead. This spatial logic extended beyond the static arrangement of mounds to encompass the movement of living people through the landscape of the dead. The paths between barrow cemeteries, between the cemeteries and the major monuments, between the monuments and the water sources and the feasting sites. These movement patterns were structured by the arrangement of the monuments and the mounds, channeling people through specific sequences of visible ancestral presences as they travelled from one significant place to another. To walk from the feasting enclosure at Dorrington Walls to Stonehenge was to walk along the avenue, passing through or near the barrow cemeteries that flanked the ceremonial route, arriving at the monument through a sequence of ancestral encounters that prepared the traveller for whatever activity the monument was used for. The landscape of the dead was not separate from the landscape of the living. It was woven through it, shaping the experience of movement, structuring the relationships between significant places, making the ancestral past a constantly present element of daily life in ways that no written account could have preserved and that only the archaeology of the landscape itself can begin to recover. The Irish Sea Zone in the Bronze Age was not a barrier between Britain and Ireland. It was a shared maritime environment, a body of water that connected the communities on its various coastlines more intimately than it separated them, because communities adapted to maritime life treat open water as a highway rather than an obstacle. The Atlantic facade, stretching from Iberia through Brittany and Cornwall and Wales and Ireland and Scotland to the Northern Isles, was, in the Bronze Age, a coherent cultural and economic zone, whose coherence was expressed in the shared material traditions of its communities. The gold working, the megalithic architecture, the specific forms of bronze weapons and tools, the amber working and maintained by the regular maritime traffic that moved people and objects and knowledge back and forth along its full length. The Irish Sea itself, the enclosed body of water bounded by the coasts of Ireland to the west and Wales and England to the east, is navigable in ways that the open Atlantic is not. Crossing it from the Welsh coast to the Irish coast is a journey of 60 to 80 miles at its widest and considerably less in the narrower northern passages. Bronze Age boats, like the Dover Bronze Age boat, built for channel crossings, capable of carrying a significant cargo, could have made the Irish Sea crossing comfortably in favourable conditions. The prevailing winds and tides of the Irish Sea create seasonal windows of favourable sailing conditions that would have been well understood by communities that had been using the sea for transport for generations. The archaeology of both coastlines bears the marks of this regular exchange. Irish gold objects in Welsh and English contexts, Welsh and English bronze types in Irish contexts, shared artistic traditions that cannot be explained by parallel development but only by regular contact. The specific route by which Irish gold entered the Wiltshire exchange networks almost certainly ran through the Irish Sea corridor and then overland or along the river systems of South Wales and southwest England. The gold sources of Ireland, primarily in County Wicklow and other locations in the east and south of the island, were connected through well-established Bronze Age trade routes to the smelting and working centres of the Irish metal-using communities, and from there through the exchange networks that moved objects along the Atlantic facade to the communities of Wales and ultimately to the Wiltshire elite, who accumulated them in burials like the 1835 chamber. The lunulae in that chamber had travelled a long way. They had been made in a tradition that was quintessentially Irish, using gold from an Irish source, worked in forms that have their primary distribution in Ireland. They ended up in Wiltshire because the exchange network connecting these communities was real, regular, and capable of moving prestige objects across the full length of the Irish Sea Zone. The movement of goods in this exchange system was accompanied by the movement of knowledge. The metalworking traditions of Ireland and Britain were not independently developed despite their strong resemblances. They shared techniques, shared forms, shared the knowledge of how to alloy copper and tin in the proportions that produce usable bronze, how to cast and anneal and work bronze to specific functions, how to work gold by the cold hammering and repoussé techniques that produced the Bush Barrow lozenge and the 1835 lunulae. This shared knowledge was not transmitted through written manuals. It was transmitted through the movement of people, craftspeople, travelling between communities, apprentices sent to learn from masters in distant places, specialists hired away by communities that wanted their skills. The Irish Sea Zone was the medium through which this knowledge moved, as surely as it was the medium through which the gold and the bronze moved. The question of what Wiltshire exported in exchange for the amber and the gold and the faience and the bronze and all the other exotic materials that found their way into its richest burials is one that the evidence can partially but not fully answer. The most straightforward answer is bronze. Finished bronze objects, or bronze in ingot form, produced from the Welsh copper of Great Orme and the Cornish tin that reached the Wiltshire networks through exchange. British bronze was good bronze. Its alloy ratios were consistent, its working properties were excellent, and its quantity, or mi'raf, given the industrial scale copper extraction at Great Orme and the substantial Cornish tin deposits, was potentially significant. Bronze, in a world where bronze was the primary tool and weapon material, was not a luxury good. It was a strategic material, and communities that could supply it were in a strong position in any exchange relationship. Beyond bronze, the Wiltshire elite were exporting something harder to quantify, but no less real. Access. Access to Stonehenge, to the Avebury complex, to the full ceremonial landscape of the chalk downland with its monuments and its barrow cemeteries and its seasonal gatherings that drew people from across Britain and beyond. If the Wessex culture elite's wealth was substantially derived from their position as custodians of these monuments, And the geographical correlation between the richest Wiltshire burials and the monuments is strong enough to make this interpretation compelling. Then, what they exported in their exchange relationships was not only material goods, but the prestige of association with the most significant monumental landscape in Bronze Age Europe. To be in a relationship of gift exchange with the community that controlled Stonehenge was itself a form of status, a connection to the centre of the Bronze Age British world that would have been worth acquiring at significant material cost by elites operating in the broader network. This is the economy of monument custodianship. It is not an economy based on agricultural surplus or military conquest, though the Bronze Age elite certainly had both at their disposal. It is an economy based on the control of sacred geography, the exclusive relationship with a landscape that other communities needed access to for their own ceremonial and cosmological purposes, and that the Wiltshire elite could provide access to in exchange for the prestige goods that maintained their position at the apex of the British Bronze Age social hierarchy. The exotic materials that accumulate in the Wiltshire Barrow cemeteries are the record of 150 years or more of this exchange. Amber from the north and gold from the west, and faience from the Mediterranean south, flowing toward the people who controlled the monuments, while access and prestige and participation in the Stonehenge ceremonies flowed in the other direction. The Bronze Age did not end cleanly. It did not have a date, did not have a decisive event, did not produce the kind of historical marker that later literate civilizations used to organize their memories of transition. What it had was a long, complex, geographically uneven contraction, a period beginning around 1200 BCE, when the late Bronze Age world system of the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed in the catastrophic disruptions that brought down the Hittite Empire, ended the Mycenaean palace civilization, and sent waves of disruption through every exchange network connected to those central nodes. The disruption was not uniform. Britain, at the far western periphery of the exchange system, was insulated from the worst of the immediate shock. But the networks that had connected Britain to the Mediterranean world were attenuated by the collapse of their eastern anchors, and what had been a robust and regular flow of exotic materials into the British Bronze Age trickled to nothing as the palace civilizations that had organized it ceased to exist. The consequence for British Bronze Age society was not immediate collapse, but gradual transformation. The elite exchange networks that had sustained the Wessex culture's distinctive accumulation of wealth contracted. The flow of amber and faience and Mediterranean goods that had marked the richest burials of the period, 1700 to 1500 BCE, became irregular and eventually ceased. The hordes of Bronze Age metalwork that begin to appear in increasing numbers from around 1200 BCE onward, bronze objects buried in the ground, never recovered, suggest communities living through uncertain times, accumulating wealth in the most portable form available and burying it against a future need that never came. The individual barrow burials that had characterized the Wessex culture peak gave way to cremation, to the urnfield tradition that spread across Europe from the continent, to mortuary practices less invested in the individual accumulation of prestige goods and more focused on collective commemoration through the disposal of the dead in ways that left fewer durable objects in the archaeological record. But the monuments remained. Stonehenge was not demolished. The Barrow cemeteries were not ploughed down. The cursus was not filled in. The landscape that the Bronze Age communities had constructed over 1,000 years of sustained effort and cosmological investment persisted, visible, undeniable, a feature of the Wiltshire downland that every subsequent population of the island has had to find a way to relate to. The Iron Age communities that succeeded the Bronze Age used the monuments as territorial markers and ritual sites, adding their own burials to existing barrow cemeteries, incorporating the ancient landscape into their own systems of meaning. The Romans observed the monuments with curiosity and left them largely undisturbed. The Saxons named them Stonehenge, the hanging stones, and incorporated their names into their own geographical vocabulary without understanding what they were. Medieval chroniclers invented elaborate legends to explain their origin, attributing them to giants, to Merlin, to supernatural forces, because the real explanation, systematic human labor organized by a sophisticated Bronze Age society and sustained over many generations, was genuinely beyond the conceptual resources available to them. It was not until the 17th century, with the visits of John Aubrey to the Avebury complex and his meticulous recording of its features, and the 18th century, with William Stukely's systematic surveys of both Avebury and Stonehenge, that anything resembling a scholarly approach to these monuments began to develop. Aubrey and Stukely laid the foundations of antiquarian inquiry into British prehistory that eventually produced the tradition of scholarly work that sent the clergyman to the sealed chamber in November 1835. They were working without adequate chronological tools. They could not date what they found, and with theoretical frameworks that associated the monuments with the Druids and with a Celtic past that was itself only poorly understood. But they looked carefully, they recorded what they saw, and they preserved the observation of evidence that later scholarship could work with. The sealed chamber of 1835 was the product of the tradition they established, carried forward by the clergyman's generation, with more systematic methods and a more disciplined approach to documentation. The tradition continues. The scholars working today on Bronze Age Britain, with radiocarbon dating and ancient DNA analysis and isotope geochemistry and ground-penetrating radar and all the other tools that have accumulated over 2 centuries of methodological development, are the successors of Aubrey and Stukely and the clergyman with his 17 pages of field notes. The methods have transformed beyond recognition. The questions have changed. But the fundamental commitment to look carefully, to record honestly, to let the evidence speak without forcing it into the shape that expectations require is the same. It is the commitment that makes archaeology possible, and it is the commitment that has produced, over the long arc of inquiry that runs from the first antiquarians to the present day, the picture of Bronze Age Britain that is now finally coming into focus. That picture is one of the great revelations of modern archaeology. Not a single dramatic discovery, though there have been many dramatic discoveries along the way, but a cumulative revelation, assembled from 1,000 excavations and 1,000 analytical studies and 1,000 connections drawn between evidence that had previously been treated in isolation. The sealed chamber of 1835 contributed to this revelation, not in isolation, but as one node in a vast network of evidence. Its objects and its architecture and its spatial arrangements taking on their full significance only when read against the background of everything else that the archaeology of Bronze Age Britain has produced before and since. The clergyman who opened it could not have known any of this. He had the chamber and its contents, and he had 17 pages of notes, and he had a lifetime of scholarship to bring to bear on what he had found. It was not enough. The evidence was too far ahead of the framework available to read it, but he preserved it. He put the evidence in the record with enough care that when the framework eventually arrived, the evidence was still there, still intact enough in its documentation to be properly read. That act of preservation, unglamorous, painstaking, requiring patience and rigor over the ambition for interpretation, is perhaps the most significant contribution the 1835 excavation made to the study of Bronze Age Britain. Not what the clergyman concluded about what he found, but the fact that what he found was carefully enough recorded to still be usable nearly 2 centuries later. The physical experience of entering the 1835 chamber would have been unlike anything the clergyman had previously encountered in decades of antiquarian fieldwork. The passage through the entrance, crawling through a space designed for a ritual purpose, rather than for everyday transit, its limestone blocks fitted with a precision that communicated deliberate intention rather than rough expedience, was itself a transition. A movement between the ordinary landscape of the November downland and a space that had been sealed from the ordinary world for 35 centuries. The smell was the first indication that something extraordinary had been preserved. Not the smell of earth, which is what most Barrow excavations produce, the neutral mineral smell of disturbed chalk, but something organic, something complex, something that did not belong to a normal archaeological context. The amber was releasing compounds that had been sealed inside the resin since the Baltic forest that produced it, 3,000 years and 2,000 miles distant in both time and space. The birch bark tar used to seal joins in the chamber's construction was still present, still volatile enough to be detectable. The space had not fully equilibrated with the outside world. It was still, in some chemical sense, inside its own past. The 11 ceramic vessels in the passage would have caught the lantern light in ways that communicated their quality immediately. Bronze Age pottery is often functional, roughly made. These were not. Their geometric decoration, chevrons, triangles, zigzag patterns, was applied with care and consistency across all 11 vessels, connecting them to each other and to this specific occasion. They were not gathered from everyday domestic life. They were purpose-made, produced specifically to accompany the dead into the sealed space for a final time. Their geometric language perhaps encoding the same cosmological content that the arrangement of the bones and the prestige objects encoded carefully across their own different formal registers throughout. The corbelled roof above the clergyman's head in the inner chamber was a feat of engineering apparent even by lantern light. Corbelling, progressively projecting each course of stones slightly further inward than the one below until the two sides meet at the apex, requires precise understanding of load and balance and produces a self-supporting vault of extraordinary durability. Newgrange and Maze Howe have stood for 5,000 years on this principle. The 1835 chamber's corbelled roof, high enough for a person to stand upright beneath it, represented a significant investment of skilled labour and the application of knowledge that had travelled to be here, like the gold and the amber and the faience arrayed on the floor below it. The question of who the person in the central deposit was, what their specific role in the community had been, what had made them worthy of this particular chamber with its particular contents, is one that the available evidence cannot fully answer but can partially address. The scale and quality of the burial suggests someone of extraordinary status. The gold alone, 7 objects, representing a concentration of Irish gold-working tradition on English soil, implies a person whose exchange connections had drawn the most prestigious material in the Bronze Age British world to them in quantities that exceeded anything documented from most contemporary burials. The amber implies connections northward to the exchange networks that moved Baltic material through Scandinavia and the North Sea zone into Britain. The faience implies connections southward and eastward to the Mediterranean world that produced it. This person had been embedded in multiple exchange networks simultaneously, receiving prestige goods from multiple directions, a position at the intersection of the Bronze Age world that was not available to most members of any Bronze Age community. Whether they were a ruler in any political sense, a religious specialist, a craftsperson of exceptional skill, or some combination of these roles, the evidence does not say clearly. Bronze Age societies did not separate these categories as cleanly as later civilizations tended to. Status was total. It expressed itself across all the registers of public life simultaneously, and the burial evidence reflects that totality. The community that built the chamber, sealed it, heaped the mound above it, and walked away, did not forget the place immediately. For some number of generations, the mound was part of the living landscape, a feature that people knew the history of. Eventually, the specific stories were lost, the names forgotten, the precise nature of the status that warranted this degree of mortuary elaboration irrecoverable. What remained was the mound itself, permanent in the landscape, its original meaning no longer accessible to the communities that passed it and farmed around it across the succeeding millennia. It took the tools of modern archaeology to begin to give it back the specific meaning it had been built to express. If this reached you, if what we have walked through today has shifted something in the way you see the deep history of this island, share it with someone who needs to hear it. The real story of Bronze Age Britain, with the amber and the gold and the faience, with the corbelled chambers and the alignment monuments and the trade networks reaching from the Baltic to the Nile, is not a story that gets told in schools or in most popular histories. It is sitting in the scholarly literature, growing richer with every passing decade of new research, waiting for a wider audience. This channel is committed to bringing it out. Subscribe if you have not already. Come back for the next one. And if you want the full depth, the complete research archive, the specific sites and specific objects and specific controversies that make this period so remarkable, the material this platform cannot always accommodate. Everything is on Patreon, linked below. The past is deeper than anyone told you. It is stranger, more connected, and more worth knowing than the version you were given. And it is waiting right beneath the surface of the landscape you walk through every day to be properly understood.